Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Carbon Capture, a pathway for meeting Pennsylvania's environmental and economic goals. I'm Jeff Bobek with the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or as most people know us, C2ES. I'll be moderating our session today. First of all, thank you to our audience. We've had more than 500 people register, and we don't do too many 2-hour webinars, but if you're interested in this issue, we think those 2 hours will move very quickly. My most important role today will be to make it run on time, so I ask our speakers in advance to keep to their allotted time. 3 housekeeping notes. First of all, the audio and video from this webinar are being recorded, so anything our speakers say is literally on the record. You should receive a link to the recording by email, otherwise you can find it on the C2ES YouTube page. Second, because of the large number of speakers, we will be taking fewer questions from the audience today. However, please submit them through the questions box in the control panel, and we'll do our best, time permitting. And finally, please continue the conversation on Twitter, including at C2ES_org. Now let's talk about why we're here. A few years ago, we had the opportunity to participate in a roundtable sponsored by the Pennsylvania Environmental Council and hosted by Harrisburg University. That roundtable sought to consider how carbon capture could be deployed in Pennsylvania. Well, so much has changed since then. Most importantly, the enactment of the 45Q CO2 tax credit for storage. And of course, the regs just came out this week, so our timeliness couldn't be better. So we at C2ES asked PEC and the Clean Air Task Force if they'd be interested in holding a new roundtable. We hoped and planned for that to be an in-person event at Carnegie Mellon's beautiful Scott Institute for Energy Innovation, but you know the rest. So having said that, we view this webinar as only a first step toward developing a roadmap for Pennsylvania, and hopefully one that can be useful to other states as well. Finally, I want to acknowledge the ongoing state deployment work of the Great Plains Institute. Our effort here is meant to be complementary to that work, perhaps with more of a climate planning perspective, but we're all on the same team. So with that, let me introduce our keynote speaker, the Honorable Lou Herkman, who serves as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Clean Coal and Carbon Management. The goal of today's webinar is to connect all the dots, to understand how federal programs that support carbon capture can spur state and private joint efforts to deploy effective carbon management systems. No one is better prepared to discuss that topic than our keynote speaker. Lou is known to many of you from his time on the staff of Congressman David McKinley of West Virginia, but prior to his government service, he spent many years in the private sector at Ingersoll Rand and Siemens. And finally, he served as an officer in the United States Air Force. So, Deputy Assistant Secretary Herkman, thank you for your service, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And I'm getting a little bit of feedback on the audio, so I don't know if that could be adjusted or turned down a little bit. But anyway, thank you, Jeff, and all the folks at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, and also the other sponsors of this webinar today. You've been great advocates and educators for many years in the carbon capture, utilization, and storage space, or CCUS. I'll use that term quite a bit. And I appreciate the opportunity to participate in the webinar and share with you what the Department of Energy is doing in the CCUS space. Personally, I have deep ties to Pennsylvania. My father was born and raised in Johnstown and lived there many years. I myself lived there for 4 years, and my daughter was born in Pittsburgh. But most importantly, I've been a lifelong Steeler fan, and I could say one of the best things I've seen since this shutdown is a picture of Ben Roethlisberger with his beard shaved. And you Steeler fans out there know what that means. And I apologize to the Eagle fans on this call and non-football fans. I want to start off with a few factoids to sort of frame the importance of what DOE is doing in the CCUS space and why it is so important that CCUS is deployed. Next slide. First, fossil fuels are here to stay. They are not going to be a transition fuel. 75% plus of the energy produced in 2050 will be of fossil fuels. In a state such as Pennsylvania, which is blessed with abundant natural gas, coal, and oil, the economic well-being of the state is at stake. You can see by 2050, over 9 billion tons of coal is projected to be produced and burned in the world. That is an increase of slightly more than 1 billion tons a year from 2019 production. You could also see that natural gas and coal will provide significant amounts of electricity generation around the world in 2050. Remember, CO2 has no borders. There is a false narrative out there that you can't have a clean environment and fossil fuels. This is simply false. Pennsylvania really has the opportunity to lead in this area. Next slide. Some say batteries are the answer. Maybe so, but many people underestimate the enormity and scale of the challenge. The U.S. power system is a very complex organism. It's essentially a 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, just-in-time delivery system for electricity, with very little room for error. So you can see up here, the far left bar is the total generating capacity of the U.S. electrical system. In the middle there, that first red thin line at the bottom there, that's the 2019 battery storage capacity. That's what's been deployed so far. And then to the far right, that is what it's anticipated to be in 2025. By 2025, only 0.069% of the electrical grid capacity will have any type of battery storage. And this is for only less than 4 hours of discharge capacity. You will need CCUS on fossil fuel power generation. Next slide. Finally, the world since 2010 has invested over $2.6 trillion in renewable energy. Since 2010, CO2 emissions have continued unabated. I came from the private sector. I spent 25 years there. I'm a business guy. I look at return on investment. The one thing you can clearly say is that these expenditures have been very inefficient. When you look at the reality of the situation, CCUS will be the key technology moving forward and perhaps the most economic. Given these facts, CCUS is the key to make sure we have a strong economy, affordable electricity, and done so in an environmentally friendly manner. Next slide. Now I want to shift now and to what DOE is doing and what progress we've made. First, the American taxpayer, all you out there, have invested well over $3 billion over the past 10 years, and as a result, the U.S. is the worldwide recognized leader in CCUS. The concept of CCUS is not new. It's been going on for over 40 years. We still have challenges ahead, but we recently completed a review of the program and concluded that, quote, CCUS projects supported by DOE and other organizations around the world, which by 2019 injected more than 25 million metric tons of CO2, have shown no adverse impacts to the human health or the environment. And no DOE-supported project has observed migration of CO2 outside of the intended storage reservoir. That's a long way of saying that we've never had any leakage of CO2 from any of the projects DOE's been associated with. We're proud of the successes but we need to improve. The biggest challenge is to reduce costs, and we are focused like a laser in this area. Simply, the more practice you have, the greater experience you gain, and this naturally reduces cost and investment risk. Next slide. In late 2019, DOE announced 9 carbon capture feed studies, 5 on coal, 4 on natural gas, that totaled over $55 million in DOE funds. Many of these 9 feed studies will lead to commercial projects totaling billions of dollars in private investment. And as Jeff mentioned early, now with 45Q guidance out there, we know of probably close to at least $10 billion of investment ready to go. Next slide. We also made significant investment in 3 areas of our program: carbon capture, CO2 utilization, and carbon storage. The FEED studies I just mentioned fall into that capture bucket. We are also active in CO2 utilization and carbon storage. Additional funding opportunity announcements, or FOAs is what we call them, is in the capture bucket include one recently for direct air capture. On March 30th, we released a $10 million FOA that just closed on May 29th. Our past investments in carbon capture lend themselves well for looking at options and opportunities to address the challenges of direct air capture. We also coordinated our efforts with the DOE Office of Science, who also released a national laboratory call at the same time for breakthrough fundamental research in materials and chemical sciences for direct air capture technologies. In the utilization area, this past January, we released a funding opportunity announcement totaling $15 million in DOE investment to develop and test technologies that can utilize CO2 from power systems or other industrial sources and use the CO2 to develop valuable products. We're also investigating ways to deploy carbon capture on coal and biomass mixtures to drive toward negative emissions in an economic manner. If you recall my first slide about the 9 billion tons of coal will be burned in 2050, DOE is the only country developing a zero CO2 emission solution for coal-fired power plants around the world. Although not formally part of the CCUS budget, we're also about to release a funding opportunity announcement that will begin detailed FEED studies on the coal plants of the future. The program is called Coal First, but more importantly, the plant will have zero or near zero CO2 emissions, and CCUS is integral to the entire design of the plant. Our efforts in carbon storage, Carbon Safe is the program name, is our primary program where we have partnered with the regional partnerships to identify and deploy large-scale carbon storage. The Pennsylvania Geologic Survey participated with the Midwest Regional Carbon Sequestration Partnership and also the Mid-Atlantic U.S. Offshore Carbon Storage Resource Assessment. Carbon Safe selected 5 projects for Carbon Safe Phase 3, totaling $85 million from DOE, with a total value of nearly $115 million. The projects selected under this FOA will assess and verify safe and cost-effective commercial-scale geologic storage sites for anthropogenic CO2 emissions and to assess the technical and economic viability of carbon capture or purification technologies for sources that will supply CO2 to the storage sites. Next slide, please. I want to acknowledge and thank Sarah Forbes on my staff, and I believe she's on this call, from my office, for who many years has been following various state initiatives. I know other speakers will go into depth in some of these areas, but I did want to mention a few that I think would advance CCUS at the state level. First, financial assistance for CCUS projects and CO2 pipelines. Wyoming has established the Wyoming Pipeline Authority and authorized it to issue bonds and provide loans for CO2 transportation pipelines. Maybe establish a utility cost recovery mechanism. Offer timely reimbursement of costs incurred during construction and operation of the capture equipment or the pipeline. Some states, such as Colorado, have explicitly included CCS as an eligible technology for cost recovery mechanisms. And also clarify the legal questions about pore space ownership for long-term CO2 storage. Mineral property law varies by states. In some places you can own the surface, but not the minerals. In other states you have ownership to the center of the earth. There are states that have taken action to clarify ownership of the geological pore space for CO2. And then finally, declare CO2 storage to be in the public interest. with that, Jeff, thank you all very much, and I will hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. I just want you to know you're not the only Pittsburgh connection on the call today. So
glad to see that. Glad to see
that. A very good presentation. I have two quick questions for you. Well, one is a comment. Pore space ownership is a very important issue, and that is one that was identified by the National Petroleum Council study that the Secretary of Energy commissioned. Could you talk a little bit more about that issue?
Specifically on pore space or the study?
Yes. I mean, just how important it is to being able to build out transportation and storage.
Yeah, and it seems, on, pardon the pun, on the surface, you know, why do you worry about this? But it's one of those things that if it isn't clarified, it brings into play all kinds of ownership, legal issues, even the funding. These type of issues need to be clarified and laid out for any investor. And so from that standpoint, you know, it's critical to making sure that's done uniformly and correctly across the state. So I'm not an expert on all the legal issues with it. Maybe Sarah Forbes later could answer some of that, but that's how I would answer that.
Great. And my second question is, you talked a bit about coal, and certainly that is how the Clean Coal program started. But there's been a lot of interest, especially on the Hill, about carbon capture on natural gas and on industrial emissions. And could you talk just briefly about the program's interest in those two issues?
Yes, and I mentioned briefly those 9 FEED studies. 4 of those are on natural gas power plants, and interestingly enough, one of them's in California on a plant out there. There is a lot of interest. Obviously, you know, coal power generation is declining here in the United States. That's not a secret to anybody. But the core technology of carbon capture, the science behind it, goes across the board, either direct air capture, power generation, industrial, you name it. And so the basic science is the same. The cost and methodology will be a little bit different. But, you know, from our standpoint, we're going full speed ahead on all of them. And we've been doing it for a number of years, but you're right. We started in the power generation space primarily with coal plants, but doing quite a bit of work with natural gas now.
Great. Deputy Assistant Secretary Lou Herkman, thank you so much for being our keynote speaker today. We're going to move quickly to our first panel, and to do so, allow me to turn it over to Anna Siefken, who serves as Executive Director of the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation at Carnegie Mellon University. Anna spent most of her career making the business case for energy efficiency, clean tech innovation, and building performance as a means to address the dual challenges of energy and climate change. And that's a challenge we're all very familiar with. Anna, if you would, please tell us a little bit about the Scott Institute and go ahead and introduce our distinguished panel.
Thank you so much for the opportunity today. We certainly appreciate it. And when we meet again in person, we hope that it's at the Scott Institute in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So the Wilton E. Scott Institute for Energy Innovation at Carnegie Mellon University addresses the world's most important energy-related challenges by enabling collaborative research, strategic partnerships, public policy and outreach, entrepreneurship, and education. We seek to optimize energy resources, reduce the environmental impacts of energy production and use, and develop breakthrough technologies and solutions that will have meaningful global impact and will accelerate the transition to a sustainable, low-carbon energy future. Carbon capture and sequestration is a key element of that strategy. And with that, I actually want to introduce today's panelists. So our first panelist is Ed Rubin. So Ed is at Carnegie Mellon University, and he was a founding member of the EPP department and the founding director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Studies and the Environmental Institute. He served on advisory committees to various state and federal government agencies. He's on the national board member of the National Academies and serves regularly on its boards and study committees. Among his international activities, he was a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and co-recipient of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. He's an advisor to the Alberta Energy Ministry of Canada, and he's currently a board member of the UK CCS Research Centre. So his research explores technical, economic, and policy issues related to energy and the environment, including electric power systems, carbon capture and sequestration technologies, climate change mitigation strategies, energy and environmental technology innovation, government policies, and integrated assessments. And I will note that he is one of the most highly cited CCUS experts in the world. Our second speaker today is David Woodwell, who leads the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, or the PEC, which is a widely respected NGO founded in 1969, whose mission is to find environmental solutions for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So David has been with the PEC since 1991, and among his accomplishments at the PEC, he served on the Allegheny County Air Pollution Control Advisory Committee, the University of Pittsburgh Institute of Politics Marcellus Shale Roundtable, and the Governor's Pipeline Infrastructure Task Force. We also want to acknowledge PEC's Senior Vice President for Legal Government Affairs, John Walliser, who was instrumental in organizing this event and PEC's work in decarbonization. And finally, John Quigley serves as the director of Harrisburg University's Center for Environment, Energy, and Economy. John held various posts in the State Department of Conservation and Natural Resources from 2005 until 2011, including Chief of Staff, Acting Secretary, and finally Secretary. He returned to government service in 2015 with Governor Wolf, when Governor Wolf asked him to serve as Secretary for the Department of Environmental Protection. Few have been as directly involved in Pennsylvania's consideration of carbon capture than John Quigley. So welcome to all of you panelists. I look forward to a lively conversation.
Okay, good. Let me begin. Thanks very much, Anna. My assignment here today is to briefly try to do two things. First, to give an overview of CCUS technologies for the benefit of those of you who may not be familiar with them. And then in the context of this first panel, to highlight some of the things that have changed over the past 10 to 20 years. Next slide then. So let's begin with this schematic of a CCS system in which a power plant or an industrial process uses fossil fuels and other raw materials like limestone to produce useful products like electricity, hydrogen, or cement. That process converts the carbon in the raw materials to CO2, which is normally released to the atmosphere. And fundamentally, the job of CCS is to prevent that release. To do that, there are three major steps. First is to capture the CO2 in gaseous form and compress it into typically a supercritical liquid that can be easily pumped. Then to transport the CO2, typically through a pipeline to a storage site where it can be sequestered, typically in a well-chosen, suitable geologic formation, such as a deep saline reservoir. Important thing to note is that all three steps are commercial technologies that have been widely used, as others have already indicated. Over the last decade, there's also been growing interest in first utilizing captured CO2 to generate revenue, especially for enhanced oil recovery. You can hit the next slide, Stephanie. So that is what has put the U in CCUS, as Lou has already indicated. So let's look very quickly at each of these three steps. Next slide, please. First, the simple message of this slide is that there are many ways to capture CO2. The choice of technology depends very strongly on the particular application. Next slide. For combustion systems and for many industrial processes as well, the dominant technology in use is a so-called amine system that captures CO2 in one vessel called the absorber and releases it in a purified form in a second vessel where it is then compressed for pipeline transport. In a power plant, the CO2 capture system would be the last step in cleaning the flue gas of other pollutants that have to be removed prior to the CO2 capture step. And those restrictions have grown more severe over the past decade or so. It's also important to understand that this is a very effective technology that can capture over 90% of the CO2, with the best systems today now doing about 95% removal cost effectively. But this is also a very capital intensive and energy intensive process, which add considerably to its cost. In terms of developments over the past 10 to 15 years, there's been a lot of progress in developing new and improved sorbents and in reducing overall energy penalties. And we're also now starting to see some reductions in capital costs, which are also encouraging. Next slide, please. So here are a couple of pictures, examples of what the technology looks like in industrial applications that have to remove CO2 as an impurity in producing their products, in these cases, natural gas and hydrogen. Next slide. Here's what CO2 capture looks like in power plant applications, both in coal-fired plants and natural gas plants. These two examples are fairly small facilities, just a few tens of megawatts of electric equivalent, that were built many years ago and were used to produce CO2 for sale to, as a commodity for sale to nearby food processing plants that used it to make things like dry ice and fizzy drinks. So that CO2 is very soon released to the atmosphere. It was not sequestered. Next slide. As most of you know, the major development over the past decade was the first large-scale use of CCS at a coal-fired power plant here at the Boundary Dam plant in Canada nearly 6 years ago. Next slide. That was followed 3 years ago by a larger facility at the Petronova power plant in Texas, which is shown here. This plant captures roughly 1.5 million metric tons of CO2 per year using amine scrubbing. Next slide. Both of these two plants, Boundary Dam and Petronova, use the captured CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, which is depicted in this sketch, a utilization measure. When oil production finally ends, the CO2 remains sequestered geologically in a well-designed and monitored facility. Next slide. This slide shows a number of CCS projects globally, but of particular interest to today's webinar is the picture I put in the bottom of the CCS operation not too far from us nearby in Illinois, a site which captures industrial CO2 and sequesters it in a deep saline formation. This is a relatively new and encouraging development that potentially could be a model for things here in Pennsylvania. Next slide. Over the past decade or two, the pipeline infrastructure carrying CO2 from sources to storage sites also has expanded considerably. It's now roughly about 5,000 miles in length, roughly double what it was a decade or two ago, shown in this picture here, about 15 or 20 years ago. Nearly all of this pipeline is for enhanced oil recovery, and most of the CO2, about 80% of it, comes from natural sources in the ground. But in recent years, there have been growing amounts that have been coming from industrial facilities. So in this context, And in the context of today's webinar, there's been growing interest in pipeline hubs and clusters as opposed to single dedicated lines. And Nigel later in this presentation will elaborate a little bit more on that. Next slide, Stephanie, thanks. Next, a word about cost. My main message here is to be very careful that you understand what cost numbers mean. There are several measures of cost that are in common use that can easily be misleading or misunderstood. Let me go over just a couple of them. Here are two that are most relevant to CO2 mitigation and climate policy. The first of these is the total added cost of producing a unit of electricity or other useful product without carbon emissions levelized over the life of the planet. The second is the cost of avoiding a ton of CO2 emissions while still producing a unit of product. This is also equivalent to the price or tax you would have to pay. You would have to put on a ton of CO2 emissions to make CCS cheaper than simply paying the tax. Next slide. Next, yeah. This third measure is the one that's become most popular in recent years. It's the cost of CO2 captured. This is effectively a business perspective. It's the price or income you would need to break even if you're in the business of selling CO2 as a commodity. It's also reported in units of dollars per ton, just like the cost of CO2 avoided, but it's a much smaller number numerically because it excludes a number of mitigation costs. Next slide. Here are some numerical examples that illustrate these differences taken from a recent DOE NETL study for new coal-fired and gas-fired power plants. We don't have time to discuss this in any detail now, but again, the key message here is that the cost of capture, while certainly important and critical in the near term, is ultimately only part of the total cost needed to have low carbon electricity and other products that generate CO2. Next slide. Finally, here's a slide that I'll simply leave with you for later study, outlining some of the policy options that can foster CCUS and technology innovation. Policy drivers are critical if CCS is to grow, and that includes a mix of both policy carrots and sticks, as I like to talk about them. Most of us prefer carrots, but the mix of carrots and sticks is actually likely to be the most effective and productive way to grow CCS in its various applications. So other panelists here today will be discussing some of these options in the context of Pennsylvania. Next slide. So again, simply let me thank you. I'll look forward to comments. Here's my email address if we don't have time to get to them all today. But now let me turn it over to David, who will elaborate a bit more on the situation in Pennsylvania.
Great, thank you, Ed. So I'm David Woodwell with the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, and we are very pleased to be co-sponsoring this today, and thank you all for being here. I would give you a quick intro about PEC, but instead would encourage you to take a look at all our energy climate work and other work in Pennsylvania at www.pecpa.org. And my role today is really to give you some context for the Pennsylvania experience over about the last 13, 15 years of how we've gotten here. The caveat is to say that this is from PEC's point of view and that there are other stories, and that also all the reports that I referenced should be available on our website in what's known as the reading room. So if you could switch the slide, please, forward. So these are a few, cover shots of a few of the reports, but going back to 2007, we at PEC released the Climate Change Roadmap for Pennsylvania that had about 35 recommendations in it for what Pennsylvania should do to really take hold of its role as a greenhouse gas producer in the world. And In those 35 recommendations were two specifically for CCS. One was develop protocols for siting, and the other was develop pilot projects. Broad, not with tons of detail behind it, but it was there. That overall roadmap with all its recommendations was then the basis for the 2008 Pennsylvania Climate Change Act that was enacted by the General Assembly, signed by the governor. The act really went into the Climate Change Advisory Committee that it had DEP put together, some reporting requirements, didn't specify specific actions, but at least sort of got the ball rolling. 2008 was also the year that DCNR released the Carbon Management Advisory Group report, with which we were pleased to be intimately involved in staffing that. And DCNR's work was headed by John Quigley, who follows me on this panel. That work ran parallel to the roadmap effort that I talked about and informed it greatly. But the main CCS-related recommendations from that CMAG group were for development of both a forest carbon management plan and a geologic carbon management plan for DCNR, and also that identification of demonstration pilot projects should be made. Then something happened in Pennsylvania that I think anybody here knows about, which is unconventional shale gas hit us. And the development of unconventional shale gas and how to manage it really took all the oxygen out of the room for all environmental and conservation discussions almost for about 6 years, and really put us off on a lot of the climate as we were trying to figure out what to do with that resource. But then in 2015, at least for PEC, we sort of started coming out of that, still paying attention to the shale gas issues, methane and others. And as an offshoot of ongoing conversations about shale gas, we started working closely with CATF, the Clean Air Task Force, from whom you'll also hear shortly, to better understand the idea of deep decarbonization overall and Pennsylvania's role in achieving deep decarbonization of our electricity grid specifically, especially given that the state emits about 1% of the world's greenhouse gases, that we really thought that we had a responsibility there. Those conversations led to a deep decarbonization conference that we held in 2017 in March during a nor'easter, and we were able to pull it off happily. And then in June of that year, 2017, we issued a white paper based on what we had learned and gathered from about 100 people who we'd asked to join us. The goal of that white paper really came out that we wanted to chart a course that would reduce the Commonwealth's carbon emissions by 80% by mid-century and 100% shortly thereafter. Came out with four recommendations, four main areas of recommendation. One being there needs to be a price on carbon, clearly, and that's probably the biggest driver. Another was that CCS, CCUS really needs to be looked at hard, understood, and figure out how to implement it in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. Grid modernization and energy efficiency rounded out that group of four major areas. And if anyone thinks these are radical takes or anything, I would encourage you to take a look at Shell's Sky scenario that they've got out, which I don't think is that dissimilar from these recommendations. Then later in 2017 into 2018, we followed up that big report and that big gathering with more focused roundtables on carbon pricing, CCS, CCUS, and grid modernization. The CCS, CCUS gathering has already been referred to once, but it was really 21 handpicked folks who met at Harrisburg University, co-hosted with Secretary Quigley. And the takeaways from that day were not a specific roadmap to get CCS in, but rather our takeaways in general were that carbon capture is as much a policy issue as a technological issue at this point, or at that point. And that while it can be a unifying topic given the economic and environmental benefits of capture, utilization, storage, that there were differences of opinions on whether you should move policies or projects first or some combination thereof. It also came out CCS, CCUS has an image problem, especially with those who want to leave it in the ground, who feel there's a way to just prolong a reliance on fossil fuels. And finally, to anybody who works in Pennsylvania, this should not be a surprise. Pennsylvania presents both challenges and opportunities in the legislative and regulatory arenas. If you could switch the slide, please, to the next one. This is just to put in context for a moment the state's generation mix and put that in perspective. This is today's mix. You can read the slide. But I also want to note that as DEP is currently doing modeling around Pennsylvania joining RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, The forecast coming out of that modeling shows coal dropping to 3% of generation under a business as usual scenario by 2030, I think it was. And the next slide, please. Then with what we did was, out of all of this work, in January of 2019, we felt it was important for us to sort of make a statement. And we put together our energy and climate policy pathway for Pennsylvania and put that out. The first and primary recommendation from that and from all our work is that Pennsylvania join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, that Pennsylvania needs to be in it. The second major focus is on adapting Pennsylvania's Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard, the AEPS, which is really our RPS, to become a clean energy standard that includes not only renewables and zero carbon sources of energy and fuels, but also incentives for implementing CCS, CCUS. Now, what's happening in the state right now is that at the behest of the governor, DEP is working on its proposal to get Pennsylvania into RGGI, to start participating in that program. Although right now there is backlash from some in the General Assembly, and I think those who believe in RGGI need to continue to really push it. And on another front, we are working with members of the General Assembly, including Senator Street, who's speaking later, about possible CES legislation for Pennsylvania to develop a CES that includes CCS, CCUS. And as a final note, in January of last year, Governor Wolf did set a goal for Pennsylvania of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the state, in the Commonwealth, 26% by 2025 and 80% by 2050. That's just a really quick way to try to give some context for where the state has been, where we are, and maybe where we're headed, to really try to achieve our goals of reducing that 1% of the world's emissions down significantly. I also hope that we double down on our commitment to achieve those significant, meaningful carbon reductions. And from everything we're seeing and modeling that we've done, and seeing that clearly CCS, CCUS has to be part of that solution. And with that, I would pass it over to Secretary Quigley, the only person who has served as Secretary of both DCNR and DEP in Pennsylvania.
And I have the scars to prove it. Thanks, David.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks to CES and partners for organizing this. What I want to do very quickly is pack a lot of information into 3 slides in 7 minutes, and to talk about the foundations of what I think could be some strong Pennsylvania leadership on CCUS. And it goes back more than a decade to Act 129 of 2008. Act 129 is actually Pennsylvania's energy efficiency law. But Governor Rendell, at the time, at the behest of my former boss, Michael DeBerardinis, who was DCNR secretary when we started this work, Mike wanted to see what the role of Pennsylvania's public natural resources, the state forest, the state's geology, what role those resources had in a carbon-constrained world. And as David mentioned, we formed a carbon management advisory group to advise the agency, and PEC very ably led that work. And that's where I met David and John Walliser. And they did great work in helping us put this together. But coming out of that CMAG work, we wanted to take a really focused look at CCUS. But because we knew that mounting the challenge of CCUS in Pennsylvania required bipartisan support, before we did it, we actually negotiated with the General Assembly and put a charge into law to require DCNR to do what it wanted to do in the first place. And that was signed by Governor Rendell in October of 2008, sorry. And we were required as an agency to conduct some studies to understand what the geologic storage potential was in Pennsylvania, to assess costs, risks, regulatory regimes, and insurance requirements to do CCUS in Pennsylvania. And the results of that work are presented in some links there. The 3 seminal documents are found at DCNR's website currently under Carbon Capture and Storage Reports. There's the link. I wrote a summary of all of that work that is posted at another website. And I'll also refer to you to Senate Bill 92, which was proposed in 2009 on a bipartisan basis in the Pennsylvania Senate, which would have operationalized the results of DCNR's study. That law would have required Pennsylvania's electricity utilities to purchase power from advanced coal combustion with limited carbon emissions facilities. So it's some interesting background and legislative grist for those of you who want to take a look at it. But one of the things that we found that was most challenging to CCUS at the time was the issue of scale. Again, back in 2008, the world was filled with pilot projects, demonstration projects for CCUS, and the critical challenge was, how do you get CCUS to scale? And that's where the Clinton Climate Initiative came in. They contacted us and offered to help us to figure that out. And the Clinton Climate Initiative, on a pro bono basis, worked with Worley Parsons and Spectra Energy, Climate Change Capital, and a number of private energy and industrial facilities in Pennsylvania to model the development of a carbon network in Pennsylvania that would essentially retrofit 6 or 5 coal-fired power plants in Southwest Pennsylvania and develop a centralized geologic storage facility. But we found very simply that Pennsylvania had several hundred years worth of storage capacity, not however in Southeast Pennsylvania, and that a CCUS network could be developed safely in Pennsylvania. We also identified the fact that there is EOR potential in Pennsylvania up in the northwest corner and in actually some in the southwest corner as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Next slide, please. Want to talk about the carbon network. Based on the work that the Clinton Climate Initiative led, we found that there was a huge potential to reduce the costs of deploying CCUS, taking advantage of economies of scale, shared infrastructure, the idea of clustering, designing for scale at the startup of the network design. The Clinton Climate Initiative looked at a number of commercial models, multiple supply chains, common transport and storage company, common full chain company, evaluated the pluses and minuses of those types of alternatives, looked at capturing carbon at significant scale, starting around 20 to 30 million tons a year. The build out of the network we saw would allow diverse CO2 sources and different technologies to be integrated at lower costs. But at build out, we were envisioning a carbon network that could essentially capture 1/3 of, at the time, Pennsylvania's total emissions, over 100 million tons of CO2 a year. And the numbers at that time that we looked at, again, remember that this is 2010, we're looking at total capture and compression costs of between $43 and $69 a ton, cost of transport and storage from $3 to $4.20 a ton. So we were at between $47 and $73 a ton, which frankly compared very favorably to the cost of carbon captured, as Ed would remind us, carbon captured at any project in the world that was going at the time. But it was a very significant, very ambitious effort to get this technology to scale. Next slide, please. However, to develop this kind of a network, there was obviously a need for public incentives, financial incentives, whether it's loans guarantees, cost sharing, various production or investment tax credits, accelerated depreciation, availability of governmental backstops on insurance. Looked at all of those kinds of financial requirements. Again, all of this absent the carbon price. The Clinton Initiative identified the fact that with a carbon price, the necessity of some of these public incentives would not be as great. There was obviously a need to look at clarifying pore space, as Herkman talked about a little bit earlier. In Pennsylvania, the general consensus was that the ownership of pore space ran with the surface, but that needed to be clarified to provide some regulatory certainty. We also looked, and this is where I met Sarah Forbes, who is now at DOE, worked with the World Resources Institute to identify some of the issues around siting these projects. Refer you to that document, a very rich resource. But one of the last things I'll say is that we also identified in our work the potential of the natural gas industry to lead here on the deployment of CCUS. The gas industry has all the necessary skill sets, geotechnology, rights assembly, transmission expertise, storage expertise. We identified, again, 10 years ago, that the gas industry could play a leadership role. So I think we laid a foundation that Pennsylvania can continue to build on to address the deployment of this crucial technology. With that, I will turn it back to Jeff.
Thank you, John. In the 3 minutes we have left before we get to our next panel, I'd like to ask Anna or the rest of the panelists if they have questions for one another. But first, a quick observation. It does seem like we're developing a few themes here. First of all is the importance of determining cost. And adjacent to that is the question of you know, how do you determine cost? But you know, is it cost of capture or is it cost of this entire value chain? And so, but with that, let me turn it back to Anna or any of the panelists.
Well, since I raised the issue of cost, let me just try to elaborate a bit. It really depends on what business you're in and what your objectives are. When CCS kind of came on the radar screen 20 years ago, it was in the context of addressing the climate problem, reducing CO2 emissions on a large scale globally to mitigate climate change. CCS is an environmental, I call it environmental technology. Its basic job is to solve a societal problem. So the question is, how do you create markets for a technology like that? That's where the policy handle is absolutely critical. We wouldn't have particulate control, we wouldn't have wastewater control without a policy incentive. So the first set of numbers that were the key focus was that perspective. It was basically kind of the public perspective. What does it cost to work the societal problem? Later, as the policy measures that were expected failed to materialize, the question then becomes, how do we keep this technology going? How do we keep it alive? And how do we promote work in the absence of strong policy measures? And so the perspective started shifting more toward the business perspective. Can we somehow create a value proposition in which CCS makes sense economically in the absence of policy drivers? That's a useful perspective. You can only push it so far. And the question again is, how much CO2 reduction would that achieve? But where we are now, I think this is very clearly the perspective. We have some new policy incentives through these 45Q tax credits, which are kind of focused on the cost of capture. So as a way of getting the technology moving, keeping it moving, that's, I think, the fundamental reason you see these two perspectives. But I mention it simply because we shouldn't lose sight of the other measure. It's eventually the one we have to get back to.
Thanks. Well, with that, we'll move on. We had hit a couple of points there, though. John Quigley, you mentioned the interest in hubs and clusters. We'll get into that next. And again, I think part of the cost issue is the issue of commercialization. In other words, where do we find value streams that augment the viability, employability? So with that, let's go on to our next panel, if we might. Our next two speakers will look at the present greenhouse gas and energy situation in Pennsylvania and explore a potential comprehensive approach to deploying it, the one I just mentioned, hubs and clusters. First of all, John Thompson is Technology and Markets Director for the Clean Air Task Force. CATF's mission is to push for change in technologies and policies needed to get to zero emissions, high energy planet at an affordable cost. John's work at CATF focuses on policy design to overcome barriers facing CCUS, including policies to develop transformational technologies and to overcome other barriers that limit the application of CCUS. Our second speaker is Nigel Genvy. Nigel serves as Global Head of Carbon Management at Gaffney Klein, which is a subsidiary of Baker Hughes, provides consulting on carbon management options for energy providers. Nigel was one of the principal authors of the recent National Petroleum Council study on deploying carbon capture commissioned by the U.S. Secretary of Energy. And Bob Perciasepi and I had the opportunity to work with Nigel on that. Nigel comes to Gaffney Klein after 15 years with Shell, Maersk, and BP, so he knows the gas and oil industry very well. So with that, let me turn it to John Thompson.
Thanks, Jeff. Let's go to my first slide if we can. I'm John Thompson. I'm with the Clean Air Task Force. I'm Technology and Markets Director. Nigel and I are going to be talking a little bit about that system approach to carbon capture and storage that John Quigley referred to and talked about at some length in the previous panel. So Nigel and I are going to kind of expand on those system ideas. And I'm going to start by sharing some information about Pennsylvania sources, how much they emit, where they're located, and storage options. And I'm going to focus my discussion on sort of the Pennsylvania landscape. So I'll talk about costs, I'll talk about availability, I'll talk about where we can store things, and I'll try to tie this into a larger system. And then Nigel is going to follow me, and he's going to broaden that discussion and talk a little bit more about what's happening elsewhere on hubs and clusters throughout the United States and sort of the efficiencies that can arise from that. So if I could go to the next slide, please. What I'd like to do is start at the back end, not the capture side, not the transport side, but start at the storage part of this. And I'm going to start with a map of Pennsylvania, or maps of Pennsylvania. And I realize these are kind of small on the screen, but basically I want to underscore a point that John Quigley mentioned earlier. Western Pennsylvania is likely your best CO2 storage option. You can see that in the map on the lower left of the screen. It has sort of, it almost divides the state into two areas, an eastern and a western side. The western side is kind of a bluish, darkish area. That's basically where the best CO2 storage options are. The sort of figure on the right shows a lot of green dots. That kind of shows potential enhanced oil recovery. And that was the storage option that Ed Rubin talked about earlier in the panel as well. I want to just say that even though it looks like Western Pennsylvania is the most likely CO2 storage option, the characterization activities in the state are at a pretty early stage compared to, say, other states like Illinois or even Ohio. And we really need some detailed regional characterization work to take place. That means drilling some wells, testing some injectivity, doing those sorts of things. And because otherwise, we're left with sort of some preliminary estimates. Right now, you can go on the website of NETL. You can download sort of a saline storage tool. It's an Excel spreadsheet. And if you look at it from Pennsylvania's perspective, what they show is maybe $25 a ton to inject CO2 in the best places in Pennsylvania. Those are preliminary numbers, and I would just point out that's pretty high relative to some other states. And by sort of doing better characterization, there's the opportunity to see if those are really that high or whether it can go down. Now, there's options, of course, with enhanced oil recovery. You pay people to give you CO2, you inject it in the ground, it produces more oil. That oil sales offset the cost of capture or cost of injection. And so that's why so many projects in the United States for carbon capture began with enhanced oil recovery. The challenge in states like Pennsylvania are similar to the challenges that states like where I'm from in Illinois. The oil fields are old, they're small, they're owned by small family operations. To do EOR, you need to do it on a large scale. You need lots and lots of people joining forces. So I would just say that the key thing to begin with here is to understand the storage options. And what it really suggests, this map, is that you're going to start in the west first before you do anything in the eastern side of the state. Because that means you're going to, if you start on the east, you're going to have to deal with transport. Let me turn now to the transportation side of this. Next slide, please. So naturally, Pennsylvania doesn't have CO2 pipelines at the moment. That's because the only place you have them basically are the slides where places that do enhanced oil recovery like Texas. What we do have is a lot of gas and oil pipelines, and what those show is the impact of terrain and mountains in Pennsylvania. What you see on the left side is just a relief map of the terrain in Pennsylvania. The lighter areas are the highest peaks. And what you see on the right is just sort of gas transmission and oil pipelines. Oil is primarily the stuff in the red. What you'll notice is that you've got a lot of pipelines in the west. You have a lot in the east, but they don't join very much. There's a few, one or two there that kind of cut across the state. That's because pipelines don't like mountains. You have to make them big. You have to overcome the extra cost. And so for those reasons, it's probably why this map tells you the geology and the pipelines are going to tell you that you're going to start in the west and you're going to build out your carbon capture there, and then later add capture on stuff from the east. Next slide, please. The other thing I want to just point out about CO2 pipelines is that they're not just a function of cost by terrain. They are a function of how much mass of CO2 moves through them. And what you see in this chart is basically on the vertical axis is transportation costs of dollars per ton of CO2 per kilometer of pipeline. And what this basically shows is the more mass that you have, the more prices fall for that length of pipeline, and it falls pretty rapidly, and levels out. You really need scale. So I believe earlier John Quigley was talking about a 20 to 30 million ton startup. If you notice, that just gets you past the bend of the transportation curve. At 100 million, I think the second John Quigley was talking about, you're down at that low levels. So really what this suggests is that you often have to start at small levels. So you want to be close to the place where the storage is possible. And so if you're going to move CO2 from, say, Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, you're wanting to do that with a lot of volume so you can minimize the transportation costs. Next slide, please. What I want to do is just summarize the implications of these maps and these pipeline slides that I've just showed you. The first thing is really the state needs a lot better characterization of the storage to understand the injection costs. Are we looking at $25 a ton? Are we looking at $10 a ton? Studies are going to help answer that question. Secondly, the map suggests that we're going to start in the western part of the state and that the eastern part of the state is going to take a little longer because of the pipeline costs. And this is where I think we can overcome a number of these problems. I'd like to talk to you briefly about the need or the possibility of establishing a utility in the state, something like a CO2 storage and transportation utility that's in charge of developing storage sites and pipelines. Lou Herkman talked about the Wyoming Pipeline Authority that is operating and can finance some of these things. Imagine instead that you had an authority in the state that dealt with establishing storage sites, whether it's EOR or whether it's saline, and also the pipelines to address those. The beauty of that is that it provides certainty about storage, and certainty is actually more important right now than price. If you're going to make $1 billion investment on capital to capture CO2, you can't afford even a pinhole risk that you don't have a place to store the CO2. If you have that certainty, if you have an authority that says we're developing the storage sites, we're developing the pipelines, and that it's known that you can do this, those projects, even if they're more expensive, have an easier time of getting built. So let's turn to projects now. Next slide, please. This map shows the stationary CO2 sources in Pennsylvania, probably distributed pretty broadly, but a lot in the east, a lot in the west. These are power sources. These are industrial sources like cement, iron, and steel. Next slide, please. I want to talk to you a little bit about volumes of CO2. That big bar across the top is the amount that comes from power plants. The smaller bars are industrial sources, refineries, iron and steel, cement. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk first about those smaller sources, cement and iron and steel. You can't eliminate CO2 from a cement plant without carbon capture. If you want to go to zero emissions in the state, and you want to have cement plants, and there are 7 of them in your state, you have to have CCS because the CO2 that comes from them, about 60% comes from the chemistry of converting lime into clinker. That is, when you heat that and turn it into the substance that you're dealing with on cement, doesn't matter if you bring that heat from renewables or coal, 60% of the emissions are actually liberated by the chemistry of turning the raw material into the final product. That's actually true of a lot of industrial processes, including iron and steel, pulp and paper, and refining. There's a significant amount that is independent of the source of fuel for heating up the process heat. It comes from the process. So you've got to, the only technology to deal with that is carbon capture. So if you want to decarbonize the industrial sector, you have to start with carbon capture. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, on the power plant side, about 80% of the emissions in their state are from power plants. Right now, most of that is from coal. If that is turned down, as Davitt mentioned, to near zero amounts by 2030, or even 10% or something, you're probably going to see a big increase in gas emissions, and those plants need carbon capture. Let me go to the next slide, please. So what I want to talk now about is some costs and about revenues. So, Ed talked about, he had some slides about capture costs, and he was very clear to distinguish between, on what basis. I'm going to be talking about CO2 captured, not CO2 avoided. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm going to be talking about some tax incentives that the federal government revamped in 2018 under 45Q, IRS 45Q. Basically, you can get $50 a ton for injection of CO2 into saline storage and $35 a ton for enhanced oil recovery. And a project can get those for like 12 years once it begins capturing. So you've got about $50 or so to work with to offset these capture costs, these transportation costs, and these storage costs. Now, my sense is that that's not enough in the state of Pennsylvania right now. And that's because, as Ed pointed out, coal plants start at around $45 to $50 a ton. Gas plants at $70 a ton, cement plants around that $50 a ton range. And those are really still, we got to close that economic gap. And that's a really small gap to close compared to where we've been, but it's still a gap. So let's go to the next slide, please. So I want to make 3 recommendations before I turn this over to Nigel to talk about some of the hubs and clusters ideas. First, to summarize, we need more funding for better CO2 storage characterization within the state to understand what our costs are really doing. We need more federal and state incentives for CCS in order to narrow the remaining cost gap after 45Q. And finally, we need to consider options that really establish and provide certainty around the CCS network of storage and transport. And those include ideas such as a storage utility and a transportation utility. And I think if you have that certainty in the state, costs will take care of themselves. Nigel, let me turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about hubs and clusters.
John, let me ask a quick question that came from our audience before we move to Nigel. And it's really a threshold question, and not to put you on the spot, maybe another of our panelists can answer it, but is there adequate storage capacity in Pennsylvania for to store a significant amount of Pennsylvania's own emissions?
It's hundreds of years of capacity. That's the number that John Quigley talked about from the 2009 studies. It's the number that's been confirmed by subsequent work. I think that there's plenty of capacity, and the issue is mostly about cost.
And the other issue I'd raise is I found your map of the pipelines fascinating, because when we think of building out a pipeline network, we often forget that there are many pipeline networks in place. So do you imagine that some of those rights of way could be used? In other words, there's an opportunity to build alongside when we build out our CO2 pipelines.
Absolutely. It's not simply the right-of-ways that are available on the gas transmission and the oil pipelines. It's also the electric transmission right-of-ways that carry, that are used, the wires that carry power from station to substations and so forth. Those right-of-ways exist, and there are plenty of them, and I think that those issues can be directly addressed.
Thank you. Well, I'll let us go to Nigel right now. I think we've certainly laid the foundation for the notion of hubs and clusters. And Nigel, I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, thanks, Jeff. Thanks, John. Many thanks indeed, of course, to CCUS and for organising and hosting the webinar. Along with Jeff and Bob's valuable input into the National Petroleum CCUS Council study that was released just in December. So I just want to recognise that and thank you very much. Best wishes, of course, to everybody that's listening in during this current health and economic crisis. My name is Nigel Genvy. I'm Global Head of Carbon Management at Gaffney Klein, located here in Houston, Texas. You probably can't tell that from my accent. However, Gaffney Klein, we're an international petroleum consultancy that's been operating worldwide for nearly 60 years. We're at Gaffney Klein focused solely on petroleum and the energy industry and specialize in the provision of policy strategy, technical, commercial assistance to governments, financial institutions, national and international oil and gas companies and energy companies worldwide. That de-risks investment in the world's energy supply. And we've heard a lot about having to de-risk and provide certainty with regards to CCUS. And indeed, that's the remit of the carbon management practice, really to de-risk energy investments through the energy transition by providing trusted and independent assessment of carbon and climate related risks and opportunities. CCUS is a part of that. We've got considerable experience with CCUS projects and technology market assessments worldwide. We've done about 65 in the last 2 decades, and that's increasing rapidly at the moment, including assignments for some of the key players. I was alternate chair, as Jeff was mentioning, to the management committee of the NPC CCUS study and led the roadmap effort. And also I co-authored with ExxonMobil and Occidental the cost and economic assessment and the chapter therein. I live in Houston with a capability that's been developed over the last 2 decades by consistent bipartisan congressional federal support for $4.5 billion worth of research, development, demonstration projects that have been executed here in the US, thanks to the DOE. So definitely a recognition to them. The US is home to over 80% of the world's existing installed CCUS capacity. And just like in Pennsylvania that we just heard from the others, there's a geological endowment here that provides hundreds of years of CO2 storage capacity for its emissions in multiple states. The wide-scale deployment of CCUS is essential to meeting the dual challenge of providing affordable, reliable energy while addressing the risks of climate change. And let's get that in context. The world needs 170 times its current CCUS capacity to be installed over the next 40 years. That will increase from the 21 projects in operation today to more than 2,000 in operation by 2050. That will require 70 to 100 capture facilities to be built each year, 6,000 kilometers of pipeline installed per year. That's about what we have already today in the US, but installed per year. And a total of 400 storage sites. The scale of that is volumetrically equivalent to the oil and gas industry today. It provides an opportunity, therefore, for US technology leadership, both the federal and the state basis, domestic infrastructure investments, domestic energy security, and continued international exports. The opportunity of hubs and clusters emerging across the world, requiring new business models, de-risking commercial challenges and complexity. Tax credits, of course, are critical to deployment here in the US. So with that, let's go through some of these slides. Next slide, please. So the opportunity of hubs and clusters, as others have mentioned, they take advantage of the fact that many emissions-intensive facilities, both in power and industry, tend to be concentrated in the same areas. Hubs and clusters, therefore, bring together some of those geographic co-location opportunities, also some proximity to storage, to significantly reduce the unit cost of CO2 storage through the economy of scale. So, of course, you can then, as we've seen, as from John, around pipeline costs and also in the storage cost sense, the more volume you get through the pipe and into the subsurface in any one location really reduces the unit costs. And it also offers other commercial synergies, of course, from a capture standpoint, about combining perhaps capture plants from different flue gas streams coming from different facilities and having a joint commingling. So this chart basically shows some of that cost reduction potential that can be achieved. Now, this really started back in the UK. And this is from 2013, really one of the groundbreaking studies around hubs and clusters, looking at really, from their standpoint, from a deployment in power, which is where their focus was back then, what a hub and cluster type approach would achieve between taking an FID in 2013, so you'll see there 160 pounds per megawatt hour, all the way down to 114 pounds per megawatt hour in 2020, and then some further cost reduction as well out into the future, into 2028. So cost reduces, and the majority of this is around the economy of scale because of a hub and cluster, not due to actual technology changes in predominantly capture. Okay, next slide, please. So indeed, we've seen really this new wave of CCUS hubs and clusters really emerge around the world, really since 2013. Now they play a really strategic role in climate change mitigation, because now we can see the volume potentials that CCUS can achieve across multiple different countries. So that indeed the key characteristics: multiple industrial and power related sources of CO2 connected to a single CO2 transport and storage network, access to that storage resource with capacity to store emissions for decades, of course. And what also characterizes those is that studies of all of the most important ones really have been supported by government, and that includes, thanks to the Department of Energy here, 6 of the 8 facilities in the US really have sprung up from the US DOE's investment in the Carbon Storage Assurance Facility Enterprise, Carbon Safe it's known as, which indeed focused on the development of storage complex for 50 million tons of CO2 from different sources in each of the different locations. So that delivers lower unit costs. The Alberta carbon trunk line needs to be noted. So that's up in Canada. You'll see it there, ACTL number 1. Actually, this was operational of Tuesday this week. So that's an important milestone. This was supported by about $500 million of Canadian Alberta government funding. And the ACTL is going to transport about 15 million tons of CO2 from some of Alberta's industrial heartland, starting off with a refinery and a fertilizer plant. The other one worth noting on here is in the North Sea. So it's the Northern Lights project. And this is really one of the most progressed major hubs and clusters. Multiple different sources being assessed in Norway. Now the storage part of that chain has gone through an FID with Shell, Total, and Equinor just in the last month, and are now waiting for the Norwegian government to confirm an FID in Q3 this year. But that promises then to really develop a storage site which can take in multiple different CO2 sources, being transported by a combination of pipeline and ship, and to then store it out into the middle of the North Sea. Very interesting business model. Next slide. So indeed, they require new business models. And that has mainly been around, indeed, of course, separating capture, multiple capture facilities with one single transport and storage infrastructure solution. So, John mentioned, of course, the transport and storage utility. This business model shows you basically in the UK, the different policies that will underpin capture, the CFD, you'll see it there on the left-hand side. And then the regulated asset-based model, which is more of a utility-based model indeed for transport and storage, and how all of the providers and the operators and the government come together really in a public-private partnership. And the next slide, please. Okay, but hubs and clusters, they address the unit cost, they get us to scale, but they do pose some additional commercial challenges by breaking up, of course, the supply chain and not having a vertically integrated single operator. And of course, that adds complexity. And of course, we need to focus as we look to deploy these on some of those challenges very early on. The other challenge, of course, is by the inclusion of industry. So on the left, you'll see the estimated impact of implementing carbon capture on the production cost. So this is out with any public support on what happens to the production cost of chemicals, iron and steel, cement, refining, hydrogen, ammonia, if you apply carbon capture, use and storage. So of course, it has a significant impact, and that's really where policy, of course, is required to help these industries and not burden them, because they cannot absorb that level of cost within, of course, their supply chain. On the right-hand side, you'll see a table of different risks and challenges that have really been mapped out, again, over in the UK for some of their projects, and really looking at what is the impact and what level of impact would it have on policy, with given some of the risks due to uncertainty and the challenges that provides. And so identifying what they are and incorporating those both into policy and regulatory environments that can work for a hub and cluster are really important. And there's some great learnings to be taken from projects globally. And the last slide, please. And so I'll leave you with tax credits here are critical to CCUS deployment. And we've had now the IRS really last week clarify really all of the issues that's indeed the NPC study on CCUS really identified that needed to be resolved in order to provide the clarity to actually be able to monetize that 45Q tax credit. But of course, times have changed, and the period of economic recovery that we'll likely see over the next few years with lower corporate profits and weaker tax equity markets is an additional challenge now. So to achieve CCUS deployment at scale, of course, through the downturn, we really need to ensure that we continue monetization of both 45Q and also, as I've got here in the bullets, 48A and B. Now that was an additional incentive. It's there already. It's not fuel and technology. It's fuel and technology specific at the moment, not like 45Q, which is fuel and technology neutral. And if we open that up and apply that on top of 45Q as well, we really get beyond just activation and into expansion of CCUS deployment at scale. The NPC study had basically, we evaluated that the effective costs level of support that would come from both of those and some other things would be about $80 to $90 per ton of CO2 on a unit capture cost basis. So the problem is now many investors will face losses well into 2022. And of course, that is along with the deadline for projects for 45Q being the 1st of the 1st 24 to be in construction. That's going to jeopardize projects that are taking FIDs and in that shorter time frame. So there has been a solution. There is precedent for a solution out there, and that's the last stimulus and recession in 2008. And the ARA Act put together the Section 1603 to basically convert tax credits into a grant, which of course at the time was for other low carbon energy technologies and was very successfully used. And of course, having something similar to that will really underpin and clarify and provide the certainty for 45Q deployment. With that, thank you very much for your time.
Nigel, thank you very much. That's an excellent presentation, and it does show us there is a pathway for hubs and clusters. I do want to quickly get to our final panel, and with that, let me introduce C2ES President Bob Perciasepe. As you know, he served as Deputy Administrator of the EPA, and also in the 1990s, back in the 1900s, as we like to say, served as in many capacities at the EPA, but also before that, he served as the leader of the Maryland Department of the Environment. So that might be his most important tick on the resume today as we're talking about state planning. So with that, let me turn it over to Bob to introduce our final panel.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Yes, Maryland and Pennsylvania do abut each other. I want to take a few seconds here to thank our co-hosts since we're getting near the end of the discussion, the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, the Clean Air Task Force, and Carnegie Mellon's Scott Institute for Energy Innovation. We really appreciate working with all you guys, David, John, Anna, Ed, and John Quigley, thank you for joining us. And of course, I want to thank the audience. I mean, we've had great participation here and looking forward to finishing this up with a panel that's going to try to bring some of this stuff together. The key takeaway so far for me is that federal policies are somewhat foundational to create an encouraging environment. Private sector and project financing is very important, but individual state policies can be designed to meet some of these challenges, both regional environmental and climate change challenges and energy needs, as well as economic development. And how we bring these together is a pretty important thing. So, from the federal side, the robust R&D, we heard from Lou Hirkman about some of the programs that are underway, a lot of activity at the federal level continuing, beginning back all the way in the Recovery Act of 2009, clearing the way or working on all of the issues to pipelines and removal of CO2. We heard many discussions of this already, existing right-of-ways and hut clusters, all of these things, there's a federal role to help there. And I also, obviously implementing the tax credit. We finally have the regulations from IRS. This is going to be a boost to give everybody the signals we need to know what's going on. And at the state level, there's a lot of really important work that needs to be done. Thinking about climate plans at the state level and the emissions, we've heard already in the webinar today that emissions come from industrial sources that are not related to energy production, but we also have energy production and natural gas and coal. And so what a clean energy standard might do, how can it be technology inclusive in including all these solutions? You know, states getting some control over how they deal with storage of CO2 and getting some of those programs delegated to them from the federal government so that they can have more localized sensitivities and control. And how does carbon capture actually fit into a state level climate plan? Many of the climate plans around the country are really forming up and have formed up for quite a while now at the state level. Where does this fit in that? And that's really an important part of what states can be doing, and we'll be hearing more momentarily. And also we heard from Nigel just now about some of the concepts around different industrial and other kinds of clusters of sources and clusters of storage opportunities. So let me introduce quickly the panel here, who I see all on the screen now. Thank you, guys. Senator Sharif Street, who represents the 3rd Senatorial District in Philadelphia, which is actually the west-northwest side of Philadelphia. He's an attorney and first elected to the state Senate in 2016 and has been getting very interested and involved in thinking through carbon capture and the role it can play at the state level. Denise Brindley, who is the executive director of the Pennsylvania Office of Energy. Obviously, this is where a lot of these things do come together. She's a hydrogeologist, very convenient, and also brings many years of state government service as well as private sector service. So we're going to look forward to hearing from her. And then Martin Williams will join us on behalf of the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers. You just heard Nigel talking about all the things that have to get built to make this work. Miles of pipeline, thousands of carbon capture installations. You can guess who will be building some of those. So Martin, we're looking forward to your comments. So with that, Senator, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, one, I want to thank you all for extending the invitation to me, and thank my other panelists. Look, I'm excited about the possibilities in this space. You know, we are advancing legislation that will look to seize on the moment where we're going to have to renew our alternative energy portfolio standards program. And what I have suggested is changing it into a clean energy standards program, and that carbon capture would be a part of that. And the idea really is, what we want as a society is a set of policies that allows us to have energy that doesn't contribute to global warming. And if we can, but I don't know why we need to exclude many sectors of our energy industry, which could operate in a net carbon neutral way if we were to employ carbon capture and we were to incentivize it. This is being coupled with a package of ideas and legislation that would include other things beyond just changing the alternative energy standard, the AEPS legislation, into clean energy standards. But we're also looking to advance things like planting trees and dealing with what I would call natural sequestration, because you have geological sequestration and artificial sequestration, but trees and a number of ways to advance natural sequestration. There's a few things that are one. Pennsylvania is an energy producing state, and we need to lead in the space of figuring out a way to continue to produce energy, not shut down our energy sector, but do it in a way that is environmentally sustainable. Two, when we succeed in doing this, we will create additional jobs. Those additional jobs will help grow Pennsylvania's economy. And then three, because of the way this is structured, where we are meeting the goals of environmentalists around global warming, but we are also creating a sustainable model that doesn't disrupt our energy industry, creating the political will to actually get something done in a place where you have both a strong energy sector, a strong environmental lobby, and a bunch of other pragmatic folks. My goal is to not just talk about something, but to develop something that, one, is based in technologies that exist, two, is economically sustainable, three, meets our goals for the environment, and four, allows us to create new jobs and grow our economy. And I think we have a proposal that allows us to do that. And I think we have a proposal that can be adopted. And I will point out, this is a proposal that is supported by both many folks in the energy industry and many environmental groups as well. And it is a bipartisan piece of legislation.
Well, thank you, Sharif. I appreciate that presentation. I think you've already started to see how the legislature is starting to think of these interconnections. So Denise, I'm going to spin it over to you to talk about the Pennsylvania Office of Energy and what you all are involved with.
Great, thank you so much for the kind invitation to join today. I think I have a couple of goals for our discussion today to get folks who are on the call thinking about how we really roll up all of the facets related to CCUS to see if we can advance this kind of work forward. The first thing I'd like to do is to really give you the overview of what's happened within the Wolf administration regarding any number of policies and instruments and orders that lay the groundwork for carbon broadly in terms of decarbonization, because I think that gives a really fitting overview and overlay to how CCUS could fit into those particular plans. I'll talk about the CCUS work group, some stuff going on with DOE and another organization called the Great Plains Institute. And then I'll just leave with a couple of comments on what my office believes needs to be done to support longer-term CCUS objectives, both through technology, regulation, and economics. So Governor Wolf's framework really began earnestly in December 2018 when Pennsylvania joined the Transportation Climate Initiative. This is a 10-state collaboration of Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states. This is an effort to cap emissions and invest in low carbon infrastructure. I'm going to buzz through these really quickly because I think what I'm really intending to do here is lay out the framework and the pieces that are coming together towards decarbonization. In January of 2019, the governor signed an executive order reaffirming the Paris goals. I know Davitt was on earlier and talked about the reductions that the governor committed to in that executive order. It also established the Governor's Green Governance Council, which is intended to address reductions in statewide energy use, either through electricity or through the purchase of electric vehicles or through the procurement of renewable energy through our portfolio for the Commonwealth owned buildings. In February of 2019, there was an electric vehicle roadmap that was put together to lay out how Pennsylvania might transition to more electric vehicle and hybrid electric vehicle use through 2030. And then in June of 2019, the Pennsylvania Solar Future Plan came out from DEP calling for 10% of solar in our portfolio through 2030. And then this particular piece, or this is actually an order in July of 2019, was discussed by Davitt as well. So thank you for laying the groundwork for that, Davitt. The commitment that the governor is interested in joining RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, to realize greater emissions reductions in our electrical sector. So that's a lot. That's a lot of activity over the last 2 years. None of it is directly related to CCUS. But I think it's starting to lay out a pathway that is broad and broad enough that all things are on the table with regard to carbon reduction. Before I get into talking about the CCUS work group, just wanted to talk about the Pennsylvania Office of Energy, which is housed in the Department of Community and Economic Development. It's intended to work closely with industry and collaborate with stakeholders on realizing our energy goals. There is a broad sector that we can work with in order to advance common energy goals. And I'm spearheading a lot of that work. And I had the good fortune of working with many agencies across the Commonwealth in their energy activities. And one of the people that I was fortunate enough to meet is Chris Carter, who is the Assistant State Geologist under the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. I know she's on the call today. I want to make sure that you all know her after this call because she has been leading carbon capture, utilization, and storage efforts in the Commonwealth. She's brilliant, and I feel very lucky to work with her on a lot of common objectives that we share. But we were able to, I think, through collaboration and great discussions and just a great working relationship, really convince others that there's incontrovertible evidence that CCUS is a necessary part of a world that reaches its climate goals. So with the folks that I was working with in industry, companies like Shell, also making those same statements, she was able to get the leverage I think she needed to establish a CCUS work group. And what's really unique about this work group is that it knits together all of the central agencies that are required to converse on these things. So DCNR is at the table, DEP is at the table, and DCED is at the table. Those three agencies cover the technical, regulatory, and economic pieces of CCUS, and Chris is at the helm of that. I have someone on my staff working with her directly, Adam Walters. I know he's on the phone today as well, so he's been a critical person in helping to advance our collaborative efforts. The work group is right now in the educational phase. So everything in government takes, when you're working multidisciplinary across various agencies, we find it important to educate one another across those boundaries in order to advance the best ideas and to get everybody's ideas at the table. But I wanted to let you know this work is ongoing. She's critical to it. And we look forward to some great ideas coming out of that work group on how we advance CCUS and PA. Just really quickly, Pennsylvania is also part of a DOE Midwest Regional Carbon Initiative, and we are a member of the Carbon Capture Work Group of GPI, which is the Great Plains Institute. So there's a body of work going on there as well. Through GPI, we are evaluating the applicability of a memorandum of understanding to join their regional carbon transport infrastructure group, which would enable us to work with many other states on how to build out the right infrastructure for this. So we're happy that we're considering doing that. I don't have an update today, but we're hopeful that that will move forward. So the last thing that I just wanted to bring up on this webinar, and we can certainly discuss it more in detail, is that I've heard a lot of great presentations today. There's a ton of smart people out there working on these things. There are certain conditions that we need to support CCUS, and it really runs the gamut from policy and legislation to economic incentives to industry interest and a good market to support something like this. But one of the key things that I would like to inject into this dialogue is the fact that we need to find a pilot project in Pennsylvania. That should be our primary goal. We can talk about broader goals and how to get there and to build the right policy infrastructure to achieve what we want. But the fastest way to reach an end goal is to actually find a company that wants to do this, to help finance and underwrite part of it and put together a good demonstration project that would put Pennsylvania in the forefront of this. Chris has reminded me over and over again that we have the geology to do this, and we know that, and that research has been going on since 2003. So beyond just putting in some test wells at this point, I think we're pretty far along. And certainly collaboration with our office and Chris and the folks here on the phone should really work together on finding a good project. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Denise. Yes, many of us work with the overall Carbon Capture Coalition. You know, one of the, I think, important aspects of our conversation today on the economic development side, which we're now entering here, is also how does this fit into the state's overall climate plan? And you just outlined, you know, the broad contours of the state's planning that's going on, and that's great, because these investments, these technologies need to fit into that, comfortably fit into a state plan, and you outlined that pretty well. Martin, I'm going to turn to you as the final presentation here, and then we'll do a little bit of conversation as we roll out the finish of the webinar. But give us the Boilermakers kind of point of view on this kind of technology and the overall effort.
Well, thanks, Bob, and hi, everyone. Again, my name is Martin Williams, and I'm the National Coordinator of State Legislative Affairs for the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers. And thank you to C2ES for allowing me to be a part of today's webinar. So one thing I like to do when speaking with a group like this or engaging public officials or policymakers is to give a quick description of who the Boilermakers are. The Boilermakers are a construction trade union headquartered in Kansas City, Kansas, whose expertise involves the fabrication, installation, maintenance, and repair of pressure vessels. We have been around for 140 years, and our members work in a variety of industries, including power generation, oil and gas refining, steel, shipbuilding, rail, cement, and manufacturing. And thanks to the vision and leadership of our international president, Newton Jones, we have a long history of advocacy for carbon capture and working with groups like C2ES, Global CCS Institute, Carbon Capture Coalition to advance pro-CCUS policies. We take a lot of pride in knowing that we had a hand in lobbying successfully for 45Q and continue to work to promote policies that will build on 45Q, you know, both at the state and federal level to facilitate future projects. Our interests in CCUS are multiple. You know, first, we know that to meaningfully address and mitigate climate change, you know, widespread deployment of carbon capture is going to be needed. That is the consensus of the scientific community, the global scientific community, and every pathway modeled by the IPCC assumes the use of carbon removal strategies like CCUS and direct air capture. You know, second, carbon capture is going to allow for the continued responsible use of energy sources that are affordable, you know, reliable, and abundant. You know, this is especially important in power generation, and as states and regions need to maintain a balance with increased use of intermittent sources like solar and wind. As mentioned earlier during John Thompson's presentation, you know, carbon capture is, you know, that'll allow for significant emissions reductions in industrial processes like steel and cement, where you know, CO2 production is an integral part of the process. There's really little alternative, you know, for those processes without carbon capture. And certainly not last, but you know, vitally important to, you know, our members and other hardworking tradesmen and women throughout Pennsylvania and across the country. Carbon capture in power generation, industrial manufacturing, fuel production, and other industries means the creation of tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of jobs. And I'm not just saying this because this is going to be the logical result of the work that we're all putting forward. I'm saying it because we know from experience. Over the years, the installation of pollution control equipment related to Clean Air Act mandates provided thousands of jobs for our members, as well as a sense of stability for other construction workers. Since in the construction industry, you depend on the frequent succession of projects, to maintain a career. For Pennsylvania, the jobs potential for CCUS is very high, very strong. I want to take a moment to thank Senator Street for working on ways to advance carbon capture. I can attest to Senator Street's commitment because not that long ago, the topic that dominated the energy conversation in the state was the competitiveness of our state's nuclear power plants. And while having that conversation, it expanded into a larger discussion about overall climate mitigation strategies. And I heard consistently from Senator Street that he wanted to do something legislatively. So now we're talking about a forthcoming legislative package. So thank you, Senator Street. So talking about the jobs potential for Pennsylvania, an imminently forthcoming report from the Carbon Capture Coalition details what the typical range of jobs created would be for different types of carbon capture projects. And since I mentioned Senator Street's legislative package, which focuses on transitioning to a cleaner energy standard, I'll talk about the jobs impact potential for power generation. If we use 45Q as the threshold for eligible projects, in other words, power generation facilities that emit 500,000 tons of CO2 annually, according to available EPA data, there are 33 facilities in Pennsylvania that meet that criteria. 33 facilities that can take advantage of the 45Q tax credit. The jobs analysis in the carbon capture report tells us that a typical coal-fired retrofit project will produce anywhere from 1,800 to over 3,300 jobs during construction, and 160 to 300 operations jobs after completion. Similarly, a typical natural gas retrofit project will produce from 1,100 to nearly 2,100 jobs during construction, and 100 to 180 jobs after completion. Using the middle range of each job's, the middle of each job's range, and applying that to the number of 45Q eligible facilities, a quick and dirty extrapolation shows that CCUS has the potential to create over 67,000 construction jobs and nearly 6,000 operations jobs just in power generation. But of course that's assuming 100% deployment and not taking into account current market trends. So if we instead say that with the right policies, Pennsylvania gets to a place where a third of eligible facilities installs carbon capture equipment, still very ambitious, but we're still talking about the potential creation of nearly 23,000 construction jobs and over 2,000 operations jobs. And from our experience, particularly from the Boundary Dam project that was referenced earlier in Saskatchewan, and based on the technologies that are most often used in post-combustion right now, a significant portion of the estimated construction jobs will be Boilermaker jobs, which we think speaks to why we're so committed to CCUS. We feel that we are well positioned, given our skills, our training, and our expertise, to communicate why CCUS is so necessary. So those are jobs projections just on the capture end. There's still the jobs creation potential on the pipeline infrastructure that will be needed, as mentioned in earlier comments. some facilities will be lucky enough to be situated on or near a suitable sequestration site, but a large-scale pipeline network, both in-state and regionally, will be needed to facilitate deployment of carbon capture at the source facilities themselves. And again, referencing the forthcoming report, Carbon Capture Coalition report, depending on the diameter of pipe installed, hundreds to thousands of jobs will be created during construction. And after seeing John Thompson's slides, we're now familiar with Pennsylvania's geography. We know it's a big state, and eventually carbon capture will need to be applied to industrial sources in addition to power generation. So we're talking about hundreds of miles of pipe, which means thousands of jobs for pipe fitters and operators and laborers and other craft. I know Jeff is watching the clock, so I think I'm going to end by saying, although we're in a pandemic, I think it's timely we're having this discussion. Coming out of this, there's going to be a lot of focus on policies to reinvigorate the economy, and I think discussing ways that the state can invest in CCUS is appropriate. CCUS has the potential to meaningfully reduce carbon emissions, allow for the responsible use of fossil fuels, to provide certainty for industrial manufacturing, and create a lot of jobs. So any economic stimulus package that can achieve all of those goals deserves consideration. So I think I'll end my 5-ish minutes there, and I encourage everyone, including those on the panel, to visit cleanerfutureccs.org and check out our CCS video, Bridge to a Cleaner Energy Future. And after watching it, I think you'll get a better sense of the Boilermakers' commitment to CCS. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Martin. We're essentially out of time. Let me just say something quick, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. Senator Street, Martin, and Denise, I think your presentations in total indicate how looking at climate change more broadly, all the different solutions, Denise, that you talked about that the state of Pennsylvania is pursuing, what we heard from Nigel and now Martin and the senator's interest, all indicate the broad economic benefit. And so the whole purpose of this webinar is to talk about achieving the environmental and economic goals together. And I think you guys have laid out how that works. Senator, you've heard. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to again thank you, and to point out that it doesn't always have to be the Commonwealth spending money. When we look at the clean energy standards, the idea is we would still have a tier with to supporting the industries and the technologies that are expanding under the alternative energy portfolio standards. But we create another tier and create incentives for folks to do things like carbon capture and in that second tier, if folks can find a way to economically do it, to economically do wind or solar, they would then qualify. So the idea is you have a percentage that would advance protecting the existing alternative energies, but we then create another tier and some additional incentives to advance the things that Martin talked about. It would stir the kind of economic activity that Martin has discussed, create those kind of jobs. It wouldn't cost the Commonwealth anything, and it would move us closer to achieving net zero capacity without abandoning the huge resources that we have in terms of fossil fuels. And additionally, it could be a vehicle for protecting our nuclear energy as well.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, you just summed it up there, and if as an elected official and as state agency heads, having environmental organizations, labor, and business all sort of revolving around the same ideas, it's got to be pretty helpful. And And Senator, I'll throw in that if we do all this, there will be huge co-benefits of air pollution benefits as well. And Martin mentioned the role that the Boilermakers have made in achieving those air quality goals around the country and around the world. This would do it double up. So good kudos to all of you. Thank you for the presentations. Jeff, I'll turn it over to you and Anna, if you're still on, to finish this up.
Thank you, Bob. Well, I won't take up any more time. We'll give everyone the rest of their Thursday afternoon back. I think certainly from our standpoint, having been involved in planning this for the past few months, we think we succeeded in what we hoped to do, which was cram a lot of information into 2 hours. Where do we go from here? Well, that's the next question, and not one that we'll settle before we get off the webinar here. So with that, everyone, thank you very much. Again, this will be archived and on the C2ES YouTube page. And we look forward to continuing this journey soon.